You'll notice in your notes, it starts off with a chronology, and I thought this might be a good moment to review where we've been and to kind of understand the scope of what we're going to look at in 1st and 2nd Kings this evening, and also in the next few books that we'll study together in the next couple of weeks. So understand this. Number one, this chronology in your notes, this isn't everything in your notes, this is just some highlight dates, is about 500 years. So these two books in our English Bible are going to take up a 500-year history. That's a lot to cram in two books. 500 years of the history of Israel. Now, on top of that, when you're reading this, you're going to see a splitting of a nation, a civil war. And you're going to see Israel from its greatest point to its lowest points, as it splits in two and then is conquered by the Assyrians first in the north and the Babylonians in the south. So just to do a quick review, when we jump back to Genesis and we look at the patriarchs, if you want to write these numbers down, if you don't remember them, it might be helpful to have them all here. You go to the life of Abraham. Abraham lived around the year 2100 BC. 2100 BC. So more specifically, most scholars say 2165 is when Abraham arrives on the scene in the Old Testament. 2165 BC. And then his son is born 100 years later. So Isaac, the second patriarch, is 2065 BC. So 2165, 2065. And then Jacob, the third patriarch, shows up at the year 2006 BC. So now we're literally about 2,000 years from Jesus, and you're only in Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament. And then we know that Joseph died in the year 1804. 1804. So about 200 years after Jacob. And then we have the big event of the Exodus. So Israel's enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. Anyone remember what was the date for the Exodus from Egypt? That was one we talked about a lot. 1446. 1446 BC. 1446 BC. So if they leave Egypt in the Exodus 1446 BC, how long were they in the wilderness? 40 years. So when did they get into the Promised Land? 1406 BC. That one's an easy one. All right. So we're literally jumping from there, from 1406 BC, entering the Promised Land. We went through the period in between with the judges, Ruth, with Samuel, the last judge, King David's life last week in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And now we are going to be getting into the kingship, starting with Solomon in the book of 1 Kings. So there's some other dates on here that are important, like Saul becomes king 1050. Always remember, David becomes king in the year about 1000. That's just easy way. If Abraham's 2000, 1,000 years go by, David's 1000. That just helps me remember it really easy. Just a summary of that. Solomon becomes king 30 years later, 970 BC. And then after his death, the nation is divided in the year 931. So 40 years of Solomon's rule. And then we have the civil war. And there are two kings now, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, the north and the south. And then there are other important dates. We're not going to be able to get into like the life of Elijah and Ahab in this class, but that's in 1 Kings 874. This is a very important date. You're going to want to memorize this date. It will help you all throughout the rest of the Old Testament. All the prophets that we're going to study, you need to know these dates. 722, Assyria conquers Israel. Very important date. So basically, Israel gets in the land in 1406, and the northern kingdom of Israel is conquered in the year 722. So how long are the northern tribes in Israel? About 700 years. It's an easy way to remember it. So if Abraham's 2,000, David's 1,000, Israel enters the land, 1406. Israel is exiled to Assyria, 722, 700 years later. And then the next big date to remember is the year 586. Because 586 is when Nebuchadnezzar is going to conquer Judah and take the Jews in the southern kingdom and take them to Babylon. Talked about in books like the book of Daniel. And then we have the exile for 70 years. Now, we're not going to get that far. This book is going to end here. So 1st and 2nd Kings is going to start with Solomon, and it's going to end here with Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, being taken into captivity. So 500 years of history is what we're going to cover in this book. So again, just one more time, quick reminder. You can think of Abraham as the year 2000, David as the year 1000. You can remember the Exodus is 1406. About 700 years later is when Israel's taken in captivity to Assyria, 722. And then 586, Judah is taken in captivity to Babylon. So Israel's in the land about 700 to 900 years, mattering if you're talking about the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom. And then lastly, remember that they're going to be in captivity 70 years, which we'll get into later when we get to Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. That'll be an important date later. So, that being the case, let's talk about the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. So I want to start with a quote as we introduce 1st and 2nd Kings tonight. Paul House has written, 1st and 2nd Kings conclude a history of Israel that, generally speaking, begins in Genesis. First and 2nd Kings explain how and why Israel loses the land it fought so hard to win in Joshua, and worked so hard to organize in Judges in 1st and 2nd Samuel under David. 1st and 2nd Kings are not disinterested, flat, historical works. I have never had the privilege to teach straight through these books. I've been able to do sections of them. I hope I get to one day to do a Sunday morning series through these books. Would literally take 5 years probably. It would be a very long series, which is why I haven't. But maybe one day on a Wednesday night, because it would be or on a Sunday nights, it would be well worth your time. But we're going to try to overview this whole theme tonight. Now, again, 1st and 2nd Samuel, originally in Hebrew, were they 2 books? No, they were 1 book, right? The book of Samuel. The same is true of 1st and 2nd Kings. Originally, 1 book. Now, if you'll remember, so the Jews called this the book of Kings. There was no the book of 1st Kings, the book of 2nd Kings. If you remember, the Greek translation of the Jewish Hebrew Bible was called the what? Septuagint, the LXX. The Jews translated the Hebrew Bible, the book of Samuel, which is now 1st and 2nd Samuel, the book of Kings, which is now 1st and 2nd Kings, and they're the ones who split it up into 4 books. Remember that? We said this last week and the week before. And they called these 4 books 1st Kingdoms, 2nd Kingdoms, 3rd Kingdoms, which is 1st Kings, 4th Kingdoms, 2nd Kingdoms. So, 2nd Kings. So, again, in the Septuagint, different titles. So these were called 3rd and 4th Kings in the Septuagint. If you read a Hebrew Bible today, this is just the book of Kings. They're not separated. 1 scroll, the book of Kings. But in our English Bible, we follow the Septuagint. We've split them up, so we call them 3rd and 4th Kings. So let's think for a little bit about the authorship of the book. I'm going to go back for a minute and demonstrate something. So if the book ends right here with Nebuchadnezzar conquering the southern kingdom, and it starts up here with Solomon becoming king, 500 years, could anyone have lived through this whole season to write this whole book? Had to be multiple authors. That's a given. Also, multiple sources, because there's multiple authors. And whoever completes the book at least has to live until 586. They've got to at least live that long. But surely they have other sources to help them. Now, Jewish tradition says that the prophet Jeremiah was the author of the book. Now, I don't have time tonight to show you this, but it is interesting that when you read 2 Kings chapter 24 through 25, the text is identical to Jeremiah chapter 52. In other words, you'll find the exact words in 2 Kings you'll find in Jeremiah. So I'll show you just a little bit of it. In 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 27 to 30, we read, "In the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, evil Merodach, the king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison. He spoke kindly to him. He gave him a seat of the kings who were with him in Babylon." God was very kind to Jehoiachin here at the end of the book. Now, take your Bible and turn to Jeremiah chapter 52, please. Just want you to see this here. Jeremiah chapter 52, if you will. Look at verse 31 of Jeremiah 52. I just want to demonstrate this to you. So I think it's possible that Jeremiah had a lot to play in the writing of this book, but I don't think it's possible that he probably wrote it all. There had to be other authors that God used, and then Jeremiah maybe completed the work, or he was part of the completion of the work, maybe one of the final editors. So compare what's on the screen to Jeremiah 52, verse 31. "Now it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 25th day of the month, that evil Merodach, king of Babylon," do you see it? This is all identical text. And it actually starts, 2 Kings 24:18 to 25:30 is all of Jeremiah chapter 52. They're identical. That's a plausible reason to think Jeremiah had something to do with writing the book. The same exact word for word scripture repeated twice, which also means something. It's important. Thank you, Tamara. You nailed it. A lot of people are like, what does that mean? It's important. It's emphasized twice. We'll get to why maybe it's emphasized later, but just to give you a little idea why. So remember, the book begins, Israel is under King David. He gives the kingdom to Solomon. Solomon makes the kingdom of Israel the greatest kingdom in the world. It ends, deportation, destruction. The temple is burned. 722, the northern kingdom goes to Assyria. 586, the southern kingdom goes to Babylon. Now, what was the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel? What was the great covenant in that book? Anyone remember? What was the covenant of 1st and 2nd Samuel? So you got the Adamic covenant, the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, the law covenant, the Mosaic covenant. And then what's the next big one? The Davidic covenant. What did God say to David in 2 Samuel 7? What's that? You're going to have a kingdom, but what kind of a kingdom? A kingdom that's what? It's going to last forever. You're always going to have a king on the throne, which is fulfilled in who? Jesus. He's ruling and reigning right now. 2 Kings ends with Nebuchadnezzar coming in from Babylon and destroying Jerusalem. But it doesn't end there. That's the beauty of it. Jeremiah's book ends with Nebuchadnezzar conquering Judah and taking the people captive. And Jeremiah possibly went to Egypt as a refugee with some other Jews. But what's interesting is both these books end with this story here. So let me finish it. Look at verse 29, or in your Bible, if you're in Jeremiah 52, verse 32. He spoke kindly to him. He gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. Jehoiachin put off his prison garments. Every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table. For his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king, according to his daily needs, as long as he lived. Why do you think it ends this way, in spite of such terrible judgment and the destruction of the temple? What is God trying to tell us? There's still a descendant of David. There's still a royal king. He might not be in Jerusalem, but God has not forsaken the line of David. Now, you don't know this, and we'll get into it in the next weeks, but You've got to understand that the kings of Assyria and Babylon were the most cruel, vile men ever. We read accounts in the Bible of Israelites being taken captive. They kill the king's sons in front of him. And then what do? They gouge out his eyes and throw him into prison. Why? The last thing he saw was the death of his own children. That's cruel. That's pretty low on the low factor, right? But this king, very surprisingly, is showing mercy and is even elevating a king of Judah. That makes no sense except for God is sovereign. And he's not done with the line of David. So the book ends this way. So all that to say, we don't know who the author is. Probably multiple authors. It seems Jeremiah has a play in it. He definitely has a play in it at the end at least. And this passage, this section is repeated in both books because it's trying to tell us there's hope. Even though Judah and Israel were judged, God's not done with the line of David. That's a very important point. Now, as for the date of this, I think it's possible that most of the book was written pre-exile. I think that's very possible because there's an expression in the book that's used, to this day, which notes something from the past that's still continuing on in the time of the writer, which tells me Jeremiah wasn't the only one who wrote it, because he wouldn't have said this. So, for instance, the poles of the ark, 1 Kings 8, were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from the outside, and they are there to this day, the author says. It's not true in Jeremiah's day, right? Babylon destroys the temple. Remember how Daniel begins? Nebuchadnezzar goes into the house of God, takes everything out of it. Now, of course, there's a lot of scholarly debate. What happened to the Ark of the Covenant? Did God poof it and take it away so it didn't get defiled? Some people say that some of the Jews took it in hiding and they buried it somewhere in Israel. That's one theory. Some people think that the Ark was taken to Egypt with some of the Jews, and now it's in Africa somewhere hidden. There's a long line of Ethiopians that claim they have the Ark of the Covenant still hidden, and they guard it around the clock 24/7. We don't know what happened to the Ark. We don't know. But we do know this. When Jeremiah, if Jeremiah was the author, he would not have said it was there to this day, because it was not there anymore, okay? Now, another instance, 1 Kings 12. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. That's during the split. All right, guess what? During Jeremiah's day, there was no Israel. The northern kingdom was gone. Remember 722? Assyria takes them to captive and destroys the land. So Jeremiah could not have wrote those statements. Again, all that to say there's multiple authors. And maybe Jeremiah is the final editor to complete the book. But God gave the words. That is the important thing. So, if we're going to split this book up, again, God didn't split the book up. It was one book, the Book of Kings. The Greek translation split it up. Our English Bible follows that. I think we could give maybe two themes to each of the books. So, 1 Kings to me would be the glorification of the nation. We see the glorification of the nation. The nation of Israel, undivided, at its highest point under King Solomon. The wealthiest, wisest, most powerful leader. He expands the nation far greater than his father David did. What else does Solomon do that David did not do? Something very important. He built the temple. Remember, there was a tabernacle, and now there's a permanent temple. So we see the glorification of the nation throughout most of 1 Kings. 2 Kings would be the division of the nation. The division of the nation. And obviously we just see one bad king after another, two really good kings in the line of Judah, but a lot of bad kings, sadly, as well. Now, 1 Kings opens with the last days of David's rule and closes with the end of David's dynasty in Babylonian exile, Jehoiachin. So it starts with David, it ends with David's descendants. And it's telling the whole history of the kings, 500 years, Solomon to the last king there in exile. So, let's turn to 2 Kings chapter 17, please. 2 Kings chapter 17. one of the great themes of this book is that we have a good and all-powerful God who oversaw the destruction of his chosen people, his chosen city, and of his temple. And the reason why God chose to judge his people was because of their great sinfulness. Yet, just because God corrects his people doesn't mean he's done with his people. That's an encouraging lesson for all of us. All of us have felt the correction of God if you're really his child. But just because you've been corrected, that's not a sign that he's divorced you and done with you. Remember what Hebrews says. Those whom the Lord loves, he what? He chastens, chastises, corrects. So, yes, God takes sin seriously, but he doesn't write you off. That's the beauty of this. So 2 Kings 17, I want us to just look at a few verses here, starting at verse 7. It says, "And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God," against Yahweh their God, "who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, under the hand of Pharaoh the king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. The people of Israel did secretly against Yahweh their God things that were not right." What did they do? Here we go. "They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city." Stop there for a minute. Where were they supposed to worship? The temple. They weren't content with God's way of worship. Remember, they want to do worship their way, not God's way. That's why we don't get creative in worship. You know, people ask all the time, why don't we do like dramas during the service? Well, in years past, I've done a drama in a worship service, but I actually regret it now because that's not how God tells us how to worship. So do I think you'll go to hell if you have a big drama in your worship service? No. But I don't think it's appropriate now as I've grown in my faith because that's not the way God tells us how to worship. So what did they do? They set up for themselves pillars. They set up Asherim. So remember, Baal was the male god of the Canaanites, Asherah, the female god. They set up Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. They made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did, whom Yahweh carried away before them. That's the Canaanites. They did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. They served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do this." What are some of our idols today that maybe overlap with the idols of the biblical world? Money, obviously, huge idol for people. We often say that our idols today tend not to be on the shelf. They're idols of self, and money is one of the big ones. What's that? Yeah, social media can definitely be because it draws our attention every day. We make a sacrifice to Facebook every day of our time and our energy and our mental capacity and our emotional capacity. What else? What was that? Sports, sure. I mean, you have a giant coliseum, right? We don't think about it that way. Everyone is giving their all, screaming, shouting, praising, bowing down to, jumping up and down. I mean, a charismatic revival's got nothing on an exciting sports game, you know. Political figures following bad. 1st and 2nd Kings is all about bad leaders. It is packed with bad leaders that people follow. Why? Because of what they can do for them. One of the most wicked rulers in 1st and 2nd Kings barely gets any time. His name's Jeroboam. He was a wicked man. Now, he was one of the most successful kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. He was also one of the most wicked. He barely gets any time in the book because God snubs him because of his evil and his sin. Let's keep moving. They served idols of which the Lord said, "You should not do this." Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers, and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets." But they would not listen. They were stubborn, as the fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. So God was very merciful. He was patient. He sent them prophets. What does God send us today to warn us and try to call our attention to the truth? Pastors. What else? The Bible. The Holy Spirit, constantly convicting us. What else? Sermon on Sunday said something about it. Nature. Creation reminds us there's a big God. Who else? Children, babies, right? Galaxies and babies, that was the sermon. Children are a convicting force in the hand of God to remind us. And yeah, parents. I heard parents are supposed to be doing a part of that as well, that work. And so there are a lot of ways that God warns us. I would say his mercy, even in the public square, we take for granted. I mean, I can tell you, I decided to get off the social media world for at least a week. I just took a break because honestly, I'm tired. I share every day scriptures, godly quotes. Nobody uses them. Nobody. 1, 2 people might have something to do with it. But I see everybody liking, conversing, using all the most stupid, wicked, evil things. They reject the Word of God. They're just not interested. They don't have any joy in it, love in it. So sometimes you don't want to cast your pearls before swine, as the Bible says. So you need to pull away. Just take a break. Because it gets frustrating to be the prophet Jeremiah crying out, right? And no one cares. So we all learn that lesson. But you can't give up. Like, there are public manifestations of the gospel today in America. We should not take them for granted. As much as I critique Christian TV, I'm still glad we have the freedom to have Christian TV. Right? There's a few of them I wish would not be on TV. But I'm glad we have it. Because that's still the mercy of God, right? God is still warning a nation through that. Those old Billy Graham sermons they play on Saturday night, very prophetic to a nation today that everyone mocks and ignores and laughs at. So, continuing on, let's just finish this up. Verse 15, it says, "They despised his statutes and his covenants that he made with their fathers and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false." That would be all the things you listed: sports, politicians, money, social media, whatever. They followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do like them. They abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God. They made for themselves metal images of 2 calves. We'll see that's the northern kingdom of Israel. So when Israel split in half, Rehoboam and Judah, Jeroboam in the north, Jeroboam did not want the people in the north to go down to the temple in Jerusalem and worship. Why? That was in the other country. So you know what he did? He said, we'll worship God our way to make it more convenient. Convenience is not a good thing in worship. It's just not a good thing. It's defying God. There's a part of me right now that is like this close to saying we're going to shut down live streaming our services. I'm really this close. Because I feel like we have set people up for failure who think it's okay. Now, the reason why I'm not is I got people in Australia and Europe and people in northern states that watch our services every week because they can't go to church. But for the people locally, I would like to just shut it down because we're really leading people into sin for the most part. So many people that refuse to worship God, but they'll kick back and do it on their convenience, which is not what the church is. The church is a family, right? We don't say, we'll be family when it's convenient for us. We're convenient in the hard times. We're faithful to each other. We're committed. So this was when you read this here, they made these 2 calves out of convenience. Now, they still were worshiping the same God, but they weren't doing it God's way. What is God's way today? Don't forsake the what? The assembling of yourselves together. You can't take the Lord's Supper, you can't fellowship, you can't be under elders and deacons on the internet. You just can't do it. It doesn't work. You can try, you can get entertained, you can learn, you can be edified. You don't have church. It's just not church. It's not how God ordained church to be. And so, we got to, when you read a book like 2 Kings, you got to take the lessons that we can learn. Convenience is not acceptable. You have to worship God God's way. So they made those 2 calves. They made an Asherah and worshipped all the host of heaven and served Baal. Verse 17, the most abominable of all, what did they do? They burned their sons and daughters as offerings, which I would say could be a modern parallel, a historical parallel to abortion. They used divination and omens and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. That'd be horoscopes, the psychic hotline, palm readers. Therefore Yahweh was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but who? Tribe of Judah. That's 722. Okay? So, why does God discipline Israel? All the way up here to 2 Kings 17, we have been seeing the kings of Israel have rebelled against God. Now, again, we started with Solomon in 722. In 970. And now we're at 722. So, that's 250 years. God was merciful. Is that a long time? How long has the U.S. been around? Just throwing that out there. So, I'm not prophesying. I have no dates. I have no interest in that. God's very merciful to America. I'm telling you, I really believe he is merciful. There's still a lot of godly people in this country. There really are. I'm very thankful for that, but not as many as there used to be. But I'm just saying, he gave them 250 years to get their act together. That's a lot of generations. And then he said, enough is enough. You apply that how you want. Now, look at verse 19. Judah also did not keep the commandments of Yahweh their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. And Yahweh rejected all the descendants of Israel and afflicted them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had cast them out of his sight. And then we end, if you want to jump forward to chapter 24, I've got it on the screen if you want to just look there. The book ends, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up. Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then Jehoiakim turned and rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. And Yahweh sent against him the band of the Chaldeans and the Syrians and Moabites and Ammonites, and sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to Yahweh, the word of Yahweh that he spoke by his servants and prophets. Why? Well, the next verse tells us, this came upon Judah at the command of Yahweh to remove them out of his sight for the sins of the king Manasseh, all that he had done, and, notice this, for the what? Innocent blood he had shed. All right, now, why do I bring that up? When we get to the prophets, one of the things that we as modern-day Christians don't think about, because we're very scared of this statement, social justice. You've heard that statement. Or social gospel. Now, I have my own apparitions and fears about those terms when they're misused. But here's the thing. I don't preach a social gospel, but I think we should gospelize the social. Meaning by that, things going on in this world, whether it's government, crime, leaders, taxes, children, education, all of those things matter to God. And again, I don't preach a social gospel, which means if we just take over all the schools, everything's going to be better. Or if we just get a bunch of Christian politicians in the government, everything's going to be better. But I do believe we should gospelize the social. Christian influence should be in all those things for the better of our country. And again, we believe in, we want theonomy. We want God's law, not autonomy, independence from God. So I believe in that. Now, all that to say, when we're thinking about America and innocent blood here in verse 4, one of the things the prophets talks a lot about that's social is crime, violence, murder. Okay? The prophets often come against Israel because of the shedding of innocent blood. In fact, the Proverbs, wisdom literature, Proverbs 6 tells us God hates the hands of those who what? Shed innocent blood. It's one of the things he says. God takes the shedding of innocent blood very seriously. And again, a nation that has well over a million a year right now, abortions. And if you cumulatively take up the total, all the abortions that have happened in America, you can take that compared to all the deaths in every war of a U.S. soldier. All right? All the casualties from every war we've been in. and the hundreds of thousands of casualties from the Civil War in the U.S., and they're not even a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of abortions, the millions of abortions we've committed. So, okay, abortion's low-hanging fruit. We're evangelical Christians. We talk about that a lot. What about all the violence? I mean, just you turn on the TV every day. How many shootings are in Pensacola? 6 people died here. 3 died here. Human trafficking and the violence there. All these things, God does care about them. Innocent blood is shed a lot because of these things. All right? Sexual violence towards children. Children perverting and groping and abusing other children is a real problem right now. I mean, right now, Escambia County happens every day in the schools. That's something God hates, right? And so when you read innocent blood, this is a big problem, yes, but also remember we have a lot of violence problems too. So when you read 1st and 2nd Kings, don't forget, it's easy to judge those people and not apply it to these people. But yeah, God does take these things seriously, and we should care. We should care about. I was talking to Mark recently about Neighborhood Watch. He's doing Neighborhood Watch, him and Donna, which is awesome. And I think Christians should be involved in Neighborhood Watch. We should want our neighborhoods to not be criminal-infested places. That God's shalom does not shine in criminal-infested places. His peace is not there. Christians should be involved in these kind of things. We should care about safety and children's education and all these kind of things. So again, we should gospelize the social. Now, one more passage, 2 Kings. Actually, I'm going to skip this one because of time. I think I've made the point well. I had a lot here. Let me skip forward, and I'm going to save that for Chronicles. So let's talk about how you outline the book for a moment. So 1 Kings, chapters 1 through 11, are the United Kingdom. So if they're the United Kingdom, who's the king? There was only 3 kings in the United Kingdom. Who were the 3 kings? Saul, David, Solomon. So remember, 2 Samuel is all about who? Who's 2 Samuel all about? David. 2 Samuel, the entire book of, remember last week, the entire book of 2 Samuel, David's rule as king. Okay? So, 1 Kings opens with David dying, and Solomon ascends to the throne. So if you're going to just think about how do I teach this book, how do I study this book, attack it, I want to study the life of Solomon. Read chapters 1 through 11. That's the United Kingdom. Then, if you want to read about the divided kingdom, okay, you're going to read 1 Kings chapter 12 all the way through 2 Kings 17. What we just read, remember the judgment of the northern kingdom. What year was the northern kingdom of Israel booted out of the land by the Assyrians? 722. I'm going to ask you that a lot in the weeks ahead. Just like what year was the Exodus? 1446. What year did they get into the land? 1406. That was the 1406. There's certain dates when we're done this class at the end of this year, because I'm going to start throwing them at you more now that we're moving forward and you're getting a bigger picture. I want you to be able to, anybody say, oh yeah, Solomon was king in the year 970. And David was at the year 1000. And Abraham was the year 2100. I mean, I want you to be able to do that because that'll help you to be able to teach anyone the whole Bible. Right? If you understand the chronology of how it works and how it all fits together, it's beautiful. That's why I just asked you, what is 2 Samuel all about? It's all about David's kingship, his rule. That's what we saw last week. So, we've got the divided kingdom. And then the surviving kingdom is chapters 18 to 25 of 2 Kings. That's all about the nation of Judah, the southern kingdom. All right? And they last until what year? So if the northern kingdom is taken by the Assyrians in 722, Judah is taken by the Babylonians in what year? Close. 586. 586. Very close. 586 BC. Now, when you think about the scope of this book, so this is a book of 500 years approximately, and the books of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon all fit into 1 Kings. It's very interesting. So, why is that? Solomon wrote Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. So when you're reading 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11, you have to think during those 11 chapters, Solomon penned Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. They're tied together. See, you're putting the pieces of the puzzle together now. Also, we haven't gotten to Job yet. We'll do that when we do poetry, because Job's a poetic book. But many people think Solomon actually penned the book of Job. More on that later. But possibly, Job was written during the United Kingdom of chapters 1 through 11 as well. Now, I want to give you some numbers. I believe these are printed out. You might have some dates about the divided kingdom. So remember, Solomon's the last United Kingdom ruler. After that, the kingdom is divided in two. And as it's divided, you have the north with Solomon's son Rehoboam. You have the south with Solomon's son Rehoboam. And you have the north with Jeroboam, who sets up the two golden calves, starts the idolatry in the land right away. So two nations, north and south. All right, they had their own civil war. Whenever I'm teaching these kind of texts to students, I just bring up Captain America's Civil War. That always helps them to kind of ground in, all right? Civil War. Or, when I first came to Klondike, there were actually people here that still thought the Civil War was going on. Because they told me I was a Yankee when I came here, and I never even knew I was a Yankee. I'd never even heard of a Yankee. I thought they lived in Massachusetts. I didn't know they were above Alabama, But some people, a good way to think about this is there was a civil war. Like there was a North-South in America, or in Captain America. There was a civil war that happened, all right? So you got the north. The northern kingdom does not have the line of David. Remember that, because they don't have Jerusalem. The southern kingdom has the line of David. So notice this. It's kind of interesting how 1st and 2nd Kings tell us. Works really conveniently. Israel and Judah both have 20 rulers in the book. That's convenient. That's helpful. Now, I want to ask, are these the only rulers? We don't know for sure, but we assume that this is exactly how many rulers there were. Is it possible there might have been another king here or there not recorded? Is it possible there might have been another judge or two not recorded? It's possible, but God didn't want us to know about them if that's so. But chronologically, I feel pretty comfortable saying these probably were the only kings. So both countries have 20 kings after Solomon. What's interesting is that Israel has 0 good rulers. Judah has 8 good rulers, which tells us something. There's more bad rulers than good rulers. Now, if these are the people of God, given the law of God, under the covenant of God, what does that tell us about American politics? Right? I just want you to think about that. We often put so much stock in leaders saving us. And I'm not saying we should, again, what did I say? Gospelize the social. I want godly, high-character politicians. I'm not saying we shouldn't want it. But what I am saying is, if they couldn't get this right, okay, we should not be so shocked if we can't get it right either. That's all I'm saying. Now, there are 9 different dynasties in the northern kingdom. What is a dynasty? What does that mean? Kings in a row from what? From the same family line, correct. This is not Duck Dynasty, okay? Though they're all the same family there too. So the idea here is that, Jeroboam starts it off, but his dynasty gets shut down. Someone else takes over, right? A lot of the kings in the north get murdered. You're going to see they're evil kings. They're actually murdered, and someone else does a coup and overthrows them. In the south, in Judah, there's only one dynasty. Whose family? Just David's. The whole way through. All the way from David 1000 all the way down to 586. One dynasty. David's dynasty. So, the dates here, Solomon's son takes over 930 BC. In the north, they're judged by who in 722? I'm not trying to be redundant. I just want you to get it. Assyria. That's right. Solomon's son takes over in 930. The southern kingdom of Judah is judged by who in 586? Babylon. Babylon. Very good. So a total of 200 years and 350 years. That's what you're getting in 1st and 2nd Kings. And altogether, 500 years of history is covered in the entire book. Now, these books are not a social, political, economic history of Israel. When you read these books, don't read them like an American history book, because they're not. They are a theology book. There are certain people emphasized more than other people for a reason. The author doesn't equally tell about every king. I mentioned to you, for instance, that the king Jeroboam II, who is king of the northern kingdom, he ruled from 786 to 740 BC. One of the longest rules of the northern kingdom, Jeroboam II. Not the first Jeroboam, it's a different dynasty, Jeroboam II. Now, you know what's interesting? He only gets a couple verses in the book. But he's one of the longest rulers. Why? Well, I'm assuming it was a godly prophet who wrote this book, a Judah prophet, and that theological emphasis is not just to tell you all the bad stuff. They're trying to tell you about how God worked through what line? The line of David. And, in particular, how God was working in a rebellious people through prophets like Elijah and Elisha in the northern kingdom. And so I think that it's a theological book in light of God's covenant with David and Moses too. I think both those play a big part. What's interesting is that there are positive statements and negative statements throughout the book, and they're important statements. And these statements judge what kind of king you're reading about. Now, this Sunday, you all get the word first. This Sunday, I've been really feeling led to start our next series on the Reformation of King Hezekiah. One of the most powerful sections in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings is the King Hezekiah. You may know nothing about him, which is unfortunate, but we're going to fix that over the next 5 weeks. Because we're going to study chapters 18 to 20, and we're going to learn all about King Hezekiah and the Reformation, powerful Reformation he brought to the country of Judah. Now, the standard that is positive is that this king walked in the line of his father David. When there's a godly king, which, by the way, 0 good rulers on Israel. Nobody in Israel, the northern kingdom, walks like David. But these 8 good ones, it says about every one of them, they walked after their father David. He is the standard of righteousness. Now, on the flip side, in the northern kingdom of Israel, all right, 0 good rulers. However, of the 20, 18 of the 20 walked in the ways of their father Jeroboam, the first king of the northern kingdom, who was a wicked king. So you know this was a wicked king if he's like Jeroboam. So again, a theological book. You have 2 different kings, David or Jeroboam. Which one do you rule like? A man after God's own heart? Or do you set up idols, lead people away from the temple and away from the law of God? God takes seriously a leader that opposes, listen to this, especially during COVID right now. Just hear this. God takes seriously a leader who is against his worship, who is against his law, and who leads his people astray. God takes that seriously. Very sobering statement. See what's going on in Canada right now? You'd understand what I mean. And in some parts of the United States, places like California and other places. Very serious. So here's a couple examples of this. There's many more. Let's see here. 1 Kings 15, 1 through 3. Now, in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abijam began to reign over Judah. He reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. Now, you know what that means, right? Av is father in Hebrew. What is Shalom? Peace. There you go. Now you know some Hebrew. And Abijam walked in the sins that his father did before him. His heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father. Do you see that? You either walk like David or you don't walk like David. That determines if you're a good king. That's how each section begins as we learn about these kings. It's a theological book based on the Davidic Covenant. Now, on the flip side of that, Omri, who is the father of a very wicked king, does anyone know who he's the dad of? Probably the most famous evil king of the northern kingdom. His wife is even more famous. No one names their daughter Jezebel. Ahab, all right? Omri's the dad of Ahab, okay? Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did more evil than all who were before him, for he walked in all the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and in the sins that he made Israel to sin, provoking Yahweh, the God of Israel, to anger by their idols. So, if you're a good king, you walk like David. If you're a bad king in the north, you walk like Jeroboam. Or if you're a bad king in the south, you don't walk like David. You go your own way. You don't follow the word of David. It's interesting in this book that there's a lot of emphasis on the book of the laws in Deuteronomy. And it seems that whoever the authors were, they are showing us something. I think I had it on the previous slide. The kings who receive the most attention are those whose reigns are most notably a deviation from the Mosaic covenant faithfulness, meaning they don't walk in the law of Moses in Deuteronomy, or an affirmation of it, like King Hezekiah, who we're going to start studying on Sunday. I hope you'll be here. Some kings who were historically very important receive barely any information, scant, like Omri and Jeroboam II. All right, these are very important kings. They get very little information. So again, this is not an American history book where we've got to be fair and balanced and give every king the same amount of words because they're all important. Not at all. All right, this is a theological story of the history of God working through the Davidic line and through the wicked. So some of the things that are really pointed out from Deuteronomy include the high places. Deuteronomy has a lot to say about worshiping in the high places. And only two kings in the south completely destroy the high places. All right, Hezekiah and Josiah. Again, two radical reformers, godly men. But that's brought up a lot. You're going to see the high places mentioned a lot. God warned against worshiping in high places in Deuteronomy. You're going to see regulations for prophets. There's a lot of false prophets who show up in 1st and 2nd Kings, as well as good prophets like Elijah and Elisha. Deuteronomy has a lot to say about a real prophet or a false prophet in Deuteronomy 18. And then lastly, regulations for kings. So the things mentioned in Deuteronomy about kings are emphasized throughout these books, which makes sense. Because ultimately there's one author, God. So I want to end tonight. We're going to obviously have to do a part 2 of 1st and 2nd Kings. I thought we'd get through, but a big mouth here. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 17, and let's end just reading a few verses. I don't have this on the screen. You want to turn there. So again, remember, it was not a sin that Israel asked for a king. It was a sin that Israel rejected God's law and God's person as their king. It wasn't simply that they wanted a king, it's why they wanted a king. That was the sin. Because God in his law gave them laws about having a king. If you have a king, this is what your king should look like. So Deuteronomy 17. Let's look at verses 14 through 20. Moses writes here, "When you come to the land which Yahweh your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me." By the way, let's quiz again. Moses wrote the law at the Exodus, which was what date? 1446, the Exodus at Mount Sinai. Good. How much longer until Saul shows up as king? All right, let's make it easy. When does David become king, approximately? 1,000, right? So Saul's just a little bit earlier, okay? So we're going about 400 years early. This prophecy is 400 years before Saul, is my point, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So when you get into the land and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you, whom Yahweh your God chooses. Remember how he chose David, okay? Beautiful story in 1 Samuel. One from among your brethren you shall set as a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. By the way, U.S. government applied that rule, right? You got to be a born citizen here in this country to be president. He shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For Yahweh said to you, you shall not return that way again. Why should he not multiply horses for himself?
It says become prideful that he can run himself.
Yes. So if he's doing that, what is he doing to the people? He's taxing them to death. He's abusing them to make himself great and taking advantage of them. All right? So someone needs to tell the federal government that. Now, continuing on. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Who's the first king that does that? David. And then Solomon. We'll talk about that at the end of 1st and 2nd Kings, Solomon's wives, because that's a big question. Nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. It shouldn't be about the money. All right? And it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, which, by the way, that's why the U.S. president doesn't make $1 billion a year. Okay? That was another thing that was put into our law based off Scripture. It's interesting. Actually, our whole legal system is based off of Scripture. The prophet Isaiah says, Yahweh is our lawgiver. Yahweh is our king. Yahweh is our judge. He will save us. Let me repeat that. Our lawgiver. Who does that? Congress. Well, yeah, Yahweh, but in America, Congress. Yahweh is our king. Who's that? Executive, the president. Yahweh is our judge. Who's that? Supreme Court. All right? It's interesting that our system was in some ways based off biblical truth. Now, here, same idea. And it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book from the one before the priests, the Levites. That's very important. That's mentioned over and over in 1st and 2nd Kings. For the godly kings, they bring the law in, they have it read, they have it written down. You're going to notice that in 1st and 2nd Kings when you study it. Godly kings do this. Why do they keep recopying the Bible? What happens to your Bible after you use it a while? It falls apart. So you got to keep recopying it. So at least every generation there's going to be a new copy of the Bible in the royal court. That's the point here. Now, it shall be with him, he shall read it how long? All the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Yahweh his God and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, and he and his children in the midst of Israel. That's a godly ruler right there. That's the ruler you want, the ideal ruler. 1st and 2nd Kings are all about rulers who either do this or don't do this. 8 do this. So again, to go back to that chart that I had here, we have 8 good rulers that do this in Judah, as well as David, and of course Solomon in the beginning of his rule, and then maybe at the way end of his rule, but the middle was rough. Okay? And you have 0 from Israel. Pretty sad. And I think that whoever the author is making a big deal to point what's written in Deuteronomy 17 out, just like Deuteronomy 18 is about the prophets. And he makes a big deal to point out good prophets, bad prophets. So with that, we're going to close tonight, and we'll pray, and we will be dismissed.